Good evening, brothers and sisters and friends, and thank you for joining me for another midweek Bible study. This week's study finds us in Judges chapter 6. And as we begin, once again, it's the same cyclical problem that we have seen with Israel since the first judge came into being. And the cyclical problem is, they have peace, and then they get lax, and then they do things that are disobedient to God. So God hands them over into the hands of an oppressor. And then as that oppression is going on, then they are asking God for a deliverer. God gives them a judge, overcomes their oppressor, and then it's back to a season of peace once again. Notice verse 1. We have a new oppressor this time. Then the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord. So the Lord delivered them into the hand of Midian for 7 years. And the hand of Midian prevailed against Israel because of the Midianites. The children of Israel made for themselves the dens, the caves, and the strongholds which are in the mountains. So let's stop here in verse 1. The name of the oppressor here is Midian. Now, what makes this very interesting is because within the Old Testament we see Midian mentioned, and not always as an enemy. For example, Midian was born to Abraham by his second wife Keturah, and he was one of 6 sons to this union. The Midianites took part in trade caravans, such as the one that they had with the Ishmaelites going down to Egypt, and the one in which Joseph was sold to. That's in Genesis 37 and verse 25. We see where Moses fled to Midian and was given work and shelter by Jethro, who was a priest of Midian. And we also see within this passage in Exodus chapter 2 and verse 21 that Jethro had a daughter. Her name was Zipporah, and Moses married her. We see where Moses asked Jethro in Numbers 10 and verse 29 to be their guide through the wilderness and to help them get to the promised land that God had promised the children of Israel. But then we come to Numbers chapters 22, and there are strained relations between the Midianites and Israel. Now, Moab, the king of Moab, goes to the elders of Midian and tells them that everything that the Israelites cross, they're going to devour, because of the needs of feeding that many people, housing that many people. And so Moab has this idea that they're going to attack Israel and hopefully drive them away from their lands. And unfortunately, the elders of Midian agree with the king of Moab. And so we start to see strained relations. In Numbers 22 and verse 7, we see where Midian took part in an alliance with Moab in employing a most despicable fellow by the name of Balaam to curse Israel. We see where they were involved in the scheme at Peor in Numbers 25 verses 16 through 18. And so we go from strained relations with Midian to now hostile relations with Midian. In Numbers chapter 31 verses 1 through 8, we see war with Midian. Of course, this was commanded by God to punish the Midianites for being part of the Balaam conspiracy, and especially with what happened at Peor. And so God is going to render judgment to both Moab and Midian through this war. I believe specifically the Midianites are mentioned here in Numbers 31, verses 1 through 8. But then the aftermath of the war, we see the following things. At the beginning of verse 9 of Numbers 31, we see where the Israelites enslaved the Midianite women and children. We see at the second part of verse 9 where the Israelites plundered Midian. In verse 10 of chapter 31 of Numbers, they destroyed all the established cities of Midian. And so we see here and Moses is very angry with the people that were in charge of this military action. And the reason why is because they were not supposed to leave anything. They were not supposed to plunder. They were certainly not supposed to enslave, but they did all of this and were disobedient in the sight of God. So when we come to Judges chapter 6 and verse 1, and we see where Midian basically ransacks Israel and has taken it over in a sense, it's not very surprising because of the hostile relationship these two countries have had with each other for a long time. And the raids were bad. And we'll get to the raids here in a moment. But verse 2 is very interesting as we turn back to Judges chapter 6, because the inspired historian wants to set up for us how things looked in the land of Israel. And notice in verse 2, it says that the hand of Midian prevailed against Israel, and because of this, the children of Israel made for themselves the dens, the caves, and the strongholds which are in the mountains. Now, can you picture this? Plains that were once farmed by these Israelites, they do not have any kind of activity in the sense of towns and cities because these Israelites are afraid of the Midian raiders. And so they built for themselves homes and dwelling places in places where they can hide, in places where they can hide some of their harvest from the Midianites. And that brings in verse 3. Let's talk about the raiding parties. But there's one more point I want to make concerning Israel seeking shelter in the mountains and in the hills and in the forested areas away from the Midianite raiders. And this idea comes from the IVP Bible Background Commentary. And notice what they said. They said, with few fortified cities, the Israelites' only protection was to hide out in the hills, where they could preserve their supplies and their families. In this region, they are most likely to have used the caves from the Carmel Range into the Iron Hills, flanking the valley of Jezreel on the southwest. You're talking about in this picture of what the inspired historian has taught us at this juncture. You're talking about people that fear for their lives, for their families, for their property. What a terrible way to live. Now, the inspired historian goes on into verse 3 of Judges chapter 6. Notice the raiding parties here. So it was whenever Israel had sown, Midianites would come up also, Amalekites, and the people of the east would come up against them. Then they would encamp against them and destroy the produce of the earth as far as Gaza, and leave no sustenance for Israel, neither sheep, nor ox, nor donkey, for they would come up with their livestock and their tents, coming in as numerous as locusts. Both they and their camels were without number, and they would enter the land to destroy it. So Israel was greatly impoverished because of the Midianites, and the children of Israel cried out to the Lord. Now imagine you have worked your fingers to the bone sowing a field, and it is growing. It is ready for harvest. You've been planting other fields with other crops, and then here comes these raiders from the east. The Midianites, the Amalekites, other nomadic tribes that join with them as they pillage and plunder everything that you have worked so hard to build. You are trying to feed your family. And they're basically taking that food out of your children's mouths. How disheartening that would be. How terrible it would be to feel that level of discontent, in the sense of you've worked so hard, and yet here are these raiders coming from the east, and they're plundering and they're pillaging and they're burning. I found it very interesting how the inspired historian here in Judges chapter 6 gave us some imagery here by saying, and when these raiders would come, they were like locusts. Now, what does he mean by that? The Zondervan Bible Backgrounds commentary said this about the locusts. It says, these is and they call it the Schistosera gregaria, a species of desert locust that is normally solitary, but under certain conditions undergoes morphological and behavioral changes, resulting in migratory swarms, capable of devastating regions on an international scale. You see, when locusts turn into a swarm of locusts, they are very, very damaging. And what a fitting imagery to talk about these raiders coming from the east, and these raiders going in and taking all the harvest, and they're burning fields, and they're not allowing the Israelites to have sustenance, as the inspired historian tells us. They're not allowing them. They take their sheep, they take their ox, they take their donkeys. Just as locusts are as destructive to a field, so are these Midianite raiders and their confederates as they raid and pillage and plunder the Israelite countryside. Isn't that an awful picture? Can you imagine someone coming into your home and taking whatever they want, and you're not supposed to do anything about it? In fact, you're afraid of them, to the point to where the best that you can do for you and your family is to go live in a cave in the hills. That'd be a terrible way to live life. And according to the inspired historian, they lived this life for 7 years. 7 years of all this pillaging and plundering, and 7 years of this frightful occurrence that happens every year. There's no peace, there's no rest, knowing that at any time these raiders could come and just start ravaging the land and its people. So in verses 7 through 10, the children of Israel know that they must beseech the throne of God. Notice what they do in verse 7. It came to pass when the children of Israel cried out to the Lord because of the Midianites, that the Lord sent a prophet to the children of Israel, who said to them, Thus saith the Lord God of Israel, I brought you up from Egypt, and I brought you out of the house of bondage, and I delivered you out of the hand of the Egyptians, and out of the hand of all who oppressed you, and drove them out before you, and gave you their land. Also I said to you, I am the Lord your God. Do not fear the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell, but you have not obeyed my voice. Now, I want to focus on this for a few moments, because these people of Israel are crying out for help. You know, whenever a person finds themselves in the dark pit of agony, that their sin has caused them, they reach out, don't they? They beseech our Father in heaven for help. And that's exactly what we see these Israelites doing. And so the Lord sends a prophet. Now, what's very interesting, we don't know the prophet's name, nor do we need to know the prophet's name, but the prophecy that he received from God to tell the people of Israel reminds them of the following things. This reminds me of the passage for what a man sows, that is what he shall reap. And that is the concept of what we see God doing here as he is talking through this prophet to these people that are beseeching God, saying, God, we need your help. We are tired of these Midianite raiders. We are tired of being scared. We are tired of people stealing our food from our children's mouths. We're tired of this. But they were reaping what they had been sowing. Notice what God tells them in point number 1. He reminds them that they were emancipated out of the hands of the Egyptians. Not by Moses, not by themselves, not by the command of Pharaoh who was tired of 10 plagues, but by him, by God. Not only did he emancipate them out of the bondage of the Egyptians, he led them to the promised land. He not only led them to the promised land, but even within their disobedience and when they were wandering in the wilderness, the scriptures teach us that their sandals didn't wear out, nor did the clothes that were on their back. He fed them while they were in the wilderness. He led them to the promised land. And then he gave them the promised land. He gave them the promised land in the sense that, yes, I have given you this land. But he expected them to fight for it, because he was using Israel as a means of rendering judgment upon the Amorites whose sin had fully come to pass. And we're talking about the people that had inhabited that place of the world. But when we go to Judges chapter 1, as we did at the beginning of this lesson series, did they take God up at his word? He promised them victory. He promised them a complete takeover of the promised land. But as we saw in Judges chapter 1, and as we see the judgment rendered at Bochim, instead of staying loyal to the Lord, they went after the false gods of the people of the land, demonstrating their disobedience. After making the following points, the Lord summarizes their problem in verse 10 of chapter 6 by making this statement, "You have not obeyed my voice." The reason why they were in such hurt, the reason why they had such problems, the reason they lived in so much fear is because they had disobeyed the Lord. And because of that, they are reaping what they sowed. When we look at the application of this, sometimes we hear people blame God for their problems. When you get to the root of their problem, it's not God punishing them, but it's the consequences of their actions. That's what is punishing them. That is what God is bringing to the forefront of the mind of these Israelites. So they couldn't blame God. They couldn't blame God for all that was happening. The only ones whom they could blame were themselves. Yes, they had gone to the right source to ask for help, to ask for deliverance, but the Lord was making it known that the reason they were in this predicament to begin with is because they put themselves there by their disobedience. When you think of people today and the question that the skeptic loves to ask is, well, if God is a God of love, then why is there suffering? Why is there hurt? Why is there pain? And that can be summarized in a 3-letter word: S-I-N. Sin. And when man chose to sin, he not only hurt himself, but he hurt others as well in his sin. And that's what sin does. Sin hurts, and it pillages and plunders hearts to the point to where in some it puts fear. Someone's sin can put fear into others. There's no such thing as, well, it's my business. I'm hurting nobody but myself. That's not true. You're hurting those around you as well. These Israelites learned that lesson, and boy, were they learning it. 7 years of this pillaging and plundering and living in caves and being in fear of the next raiding party for 7 years. And why did this happen? It was because they were reaping what they had sown. But God does not leave them high and dry, if you want to use that phrase. And this is the encouraging part of the message. Go to verses 11 through 16 with me. Now the angel of the Lord came and sat under the terebinth tree, which was in Ophrah, which belonged to Joash the Abiezrite, while his son Gideon threshed wheat in the winepress, in order to hide it from the Midianites. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him and said to him, "The Lord is with you, you mighty man of valor." And Gideon said to him, "O my Lord, if the Lord is with us, why then has all this happened to us? And where are all his miracles which our fathers told us about, saying, did not the Lord bring us from Egypt? But now the Lord has forsaken us and delivered us into the hands of the Midianites." Then the Lord turned to him and said, "Go in this might of yours, and you shall save Israel from the hand of the Midianites. Have I not sent you?" Now, unfortunately, our time is up, but I didn't want to leave on a negative note. But I do want to show the people beseeched the Father. The Father gave them their answer, but we're also going to see where the Father is going to provide deliverance for them. And so, when we think about sins in this life, God has provided deliverance for those sins. And that deliverance comes through the blood of Jesus Christ. God, in his angel, was talking to Gideon. Gideon was that mighty man of valor. And as we will learn next week, Gideon was going to amass an army and throw out the Midianite invader. See, God provided a deliverer. Friend, if you find yourself in sin, or brother or sister, if you find yourself in sin this evening, I don't want you to think that all hope is lost, because hope is not lost. In fact, the Hebrew writer says that Christ is the hope, the anchor of our souls. Allow Jesus to deliver you from your problems. Allow Jesus to provide the strength so that when you're going through the consequence that your problem has brought forth, that you will be able to stand it, knowing that this is only for a short time. But when you pass from this life, eternity is waiting for you with Jesus Christ the Lord. And brother or sister, if there's a way that we can encourage you, please let us know. so we can pray with you and pray for you. Maybe there's someone out there who is not one with the Lord yet, but you would like to learn more about that so that you can receive this atonement, which brings about this reconciliation, and you can allow Jesus to deliver you from your world of sin and woe. If there's a way that we can study with you and help answer the questions that you may have, please let us know. And until we meet again, I bid you all a very pleasant good evening.